Hi, I'm Arn Menconi. Welcome back. Today we have a very special guest. We have Dr. Vijay Prashad. He's a professor of international studies at Trinity College, an author of 17 books. He'll be a keynote speaker at the Saudi Summit in Washington, D.C., hosted by Code Pink, The Nation, and the Institute for Policy Studies. Welcome, Vijay.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Arn.
Well, you've been talking a lot in the last several months about Saudi Arabia. This is what the summit is about. But big picture, what you always bring to this conversation is the big framework that Americans don't seem to understand. This military interventionism that has been going on for the past couple decades, where, for example, in Egypt, they're not modernized enough. So what we could do is go in there, work with the military regime, modernize the country through military, and if it doesn't have a democracy, use the military to replace the dictator that was there before. So this consistent replacement of moving out the dictator, putting in some form of our, I love something you said in a Chris Hedges interview, where almost every congressional district in the United States has military operations going on and business operations going on there. We have over 350 sites. But take us into our relationship with Saudi Arabia and what you think is so pertinent for people to understand right now.
Well, it's a very complicated relationship. It's a long relationship. It goes back to the 1930s, really, when the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia first started having close ties with the British. Then, it developed with a relationship with the Americans. Initially, the issue was oil. Saudi Arabia sits on a vast reservoir of oil, and as the carbon civilization of the 19th century transformed into the carbon civilization of the 20th century, where petroleum played a greater and greater role, obviously Saudi Arabia was an immensely important ally. But the relationship with Saudi Arabia is not merely about oil. That's an issue that I think has become clearer in the last few years as Saudi Arabia has pumped more and more oil in order to bring the price of oil down. Some people in the United States thought that this was a mechanism to attack the shale oil industry in the US, and the Alaska tar sands, the major, very expensive way of getting out oil from the ground. But in fact, even though the Saudis pump more oil out of the ground, despite the fact that the price of oil has gone down, actually the United States has increased its domestic production of oil in this period, hasn't relied on Saudi Arabia,
Right.
and has been able to become one of the world's largest producers of oil in this period, which means that it's not about reliance on oil from Saudi Arabia itself. I think that's misleading. It's not indeed merely about some kind of geostrategic partnership, although this is an important relationship that Saudi Arabia plays for the United States. It's a so-called pillar of stability in the Middle East. That's true, but it's not merely the cause of this close relationship. It's just another factor. I think the two principal reasons why the United States cannot easily break with Saudi Arabia have to do, number one, with finance, and the second one is, of course, with the question of arms, which is related to finance. It's an interesting business, but because the United States dollar is the major currency in which oil, particularly oil traded by Saudi Arabia, is denominated, because of that reason, the United States is able to have its Treasury Department print innumerable amounts of dollar notes without fear of inflation, because the money is also used in the so-called euro dollar market and the petrodollar market. So all these enormous oil profits of the Saudi royal family are held in US dollars. This is a stabilizing force on the one side for the US dollar. It prevents inflation. On the other side, it's an injection, enormous injection of liquidity into Western banks, because Saudi oil profits are held in Western banks. So this is a huge service that Saudi Arabia plays as far as the US dollar is concerned. I think it's important to bear in mind that in the last couple of years, the Chinese have begun to move slightly away from buying oil from Saudi Arabia and shifted to Angola and Russia. And the reason they've done this is that both Angola and Russia will denominate oil sales in renminbi, in the Chinese currency. Whereas the Saudis cannot actually politically easily shift their denomination of oil sales to China from dollar to renminbi, because this role that it plays of recycling oil profits for Western banks is actually quite fundamental. So in that sense, there is a sort of a mutual suicide pact between the United States or the West on one side and Saudi Arabia on the other. They are both immensely reliant upon this recycling function that the massive oil sales of Saudi Arabia does for the US dollar. And the second thing is, because Saudi Arabia has these enormous profits, it's been able to integrate itself with the military-industrial complex. Saudi Arabia buys billions of dollars of arms from US defense manufacturers. And you might wonder, well, what does Saudi Arabia do with these arms? It has an enormous fleet of fighter aircraft, bombers, AWACS, sophisticated battlefield equipment. Okay, you can say they used it in Yemen, but to no strategic gain. They've been bombing and fighting against Yemen since March 26th of last year. They haven't moved a jot, in terms of strategic gain. So why are they buying all these arms? Well, this is their role, again, as recycling oil profits for this section of the American manufacturing industry. And in this way, the symbiotic relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia has a lot to do with what I consider the foreign policy of the 1%. Saudi Arabia performs a function for the 1% of the American, political economy. Those who have immense investments in the financial sector, it provides this financial recycling, and those who have immense investments in the military-industrial complex. For this section, this alliance is essential. For the rest of the population, I'm not sure.
Well, Ray McGovern, who was a security advisor to George Bush Sr., said that we've sold over $100 billion of arms sales to Saudi Arabia. This goes beyond the United States. It's a multinational approach to capitalism and capitalistic imperialism. How does it play out? Let's use Syria as an example. Why is Saudi Arabia in Syria? Is it to work with the United States to topple Assad? Is it for the pipelines that they're trying to get through Syria? Or is it some other reason?
Well, I think that one of the issues that's not directly about finance or about arms sales is this paranoia that the Saudi regime has vis-a-vis Iranian influence in the region. From 1978 or 1979, when the Iranian Revolution took place, till 2003, Iran was relatively engaged, by Saddam Hussein for a very long period on one side, and on the other side by the various, collapses in Afghanistan and in the Taliban. And the United States did something very peculiar in 2001 and 2003. It overthrew the two historic enemies of Iran. On the one side, the Taliban, and on the other side, Saddam Hussein. And actually, after 2003, for the very first time, Iran was able to flex its regional muscle. And it flexed its muscle all the way out to the Mediterranean. And since 2003, both the West, not both, but all three, the West, the Israelis, and the Saudis, have been trying to engage Iran. And they've used various strategies. There was the sequential Syria Accountability Acts passed by the US Congress, which attempted to break the alliance between Damascus on the one side and Tehran on the other. There was the war that Israel prosecuted against Hezbollah, which was, in 2006, a failed war. There has been the constant attempt to delegitimize Hezbollah. United States declared it a terrorist organization. The Israelis see it as a terrorist organization, and just this week, the Gulf Arab states and Saudi Arabia have declared Hezbollah a terrorist organization. These have been attempts to break the connection between Iran and the region. And they've been quite substantial. The most spectacular, of course, was the nuclear sanctions deal, that was put through with the UN, the Europeans, and the Americans, very much trying to engage Iran again. Well, all these strategies have failed, and none of them were able to actually close off Iran from the world. If you travel to Tehran, there is evidence across the city of Chinese construction. Right through the sanctions period, the Chinese continued to trade with the Iranians. The Indians continued to trade with the Iranians. In fact, the Iranians received payment from India, which is a close ally of the United States, but the Iranians received payment from India in Indian rupees because the Iranians couldn't get the Indians to pay in any other way. So they accepted rupees in Indian banks. So what I'm saying is that they failed essentially to constrain Iran. And when the Arab Spring broke out, when the protests started in Syria, it was a perfect opportunity for the Saudis, for the Americans and others to finally cut this cord between Iran and and Syria. And in fact, it's the failure in Syria to cut the cord which has brought a measure of reality to the United States. And I would argue that the failure to effect regime change in Damascus was what actually pushed a kind of realism in the U.S. Establishment to finally make the deal with Iran on the nuclear program. It's not that the nuclear program has set a course for peace in Syria. I think it's the other way around. If they had won in Syria, there would have been no reason to have a nuclear deal, and then they would have pushed Iran harder. This way, they failed in Syria, and the Russians fully backed the Iranians to the extent that they then sent in, aircraft and started bombing of their own to protect the Damascus regime. Russian backing of Iran, Chinese diplomatic backing of Iran really demonstrated to sections of the American establishment and parts of the Saudi establishment that the way forward was not going to be so simple. So it's not going to be easy to engage Iran. And in a sense, the war against Yemen was an opportunistic war. The Saudis under a new king, King Salman, and his son Mohammed bin Salman, essentially started this war in Yemen thinking that they'll at least get some kind of victory if they've had failure in Syria. And it turned out, of course, that Yemen is an even bigger quagmire for them than Syria, and their dignity is now on the line, given that they'll not be able to win in Yemen. So instead of this, they've now swung the other way and are fighting a diplomatic war against Lebanon. First, denying Lebanon the $4 billion they promised for security, and now beginning to expel particularly Lebanese Shia workers from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf back to Lebanon. So there is a flailing about that the Saudis, the Americans, and Israelis have done around the question of Iranian influence in the region. But for them, sadly, they failed to engage Iran.
With Syria, did Saudi Arabia go into Syria after Iran did? Syria, about 5 years ago, was their own sort of Arab Spring, their own little civil war, and then all of a sudden, all the international players started to come in. What triggered Syria? What triggered Saudi Arabia going in?
Well, to be fair to the story, Syria's relationship with Iran predates the Arab Spring. Right. That is the reason why the Syria Accountability Act was so important for the Americans.
Well, may I interrupt? Was it that Assad relied on Iran for weapons in order to fight a civil war? Is that then Saudi Arabia came in?
No, I think the Iranians were actually assisting Syria before the Arab Spring even began. I mean, Syria was the conduit to get weapons to Hezbollah. That's a fact. Hezbollah was being armed by Iran right from the period of the 1990s, and the arms were going through Syria. That is there on the table. It was to break that connection that I think there was this sort of almost apoplectic attempt from about at least 2003 onwards.
And how?
But Iran didn't actually send troops in, and does not have troops in Syria even now. What it has is a few advisors, but a lot of arms were sent to the Syrian army to, in a sense, to lift its morale. And Iran facilitated the entry of militias. On the one side, Hezbollah from Lebanon, but also Iraqi militias to enter into Syria. So it wasn't so much, official Iranian troops entering. It was the role Iran played regionally to help bolster the Assad government. But now you asked a different question: who came first, the Saudis or the Iranians? To my mind, actually, this may not be an important question because, in a sense, they were both intervening in Syria in different ways. Patrick Searle, the journalist in 1965, said Syria is the mirror of rival interests. And indeed, this has been the case in Syria for a very long time. So whether the first Iranian gun comes before the first Saudi gun might not be the most important question.
Right, and I don't want to bring in that sort of additional issue of, does it have to do with oil lines? There's 3 pipelines that are being fought over, and 2 of them are through Syria, and we don't have time to go into that. But let's move into, we talked about Syria and Yemen. What specifically is Saudi Arabia doing in order to help fight in Saudi Arabia? Are they giving arms to al-Nusra? And then we really need to drill down into the human rights issue. What is Saudi Arabia doing? I think it was 23,000 missiles have been dropped in Yemen. 1 in 4 Yemenis have been displaced. The issues are staggering with the amount of hospitals and schools that have been wiped out. What are they doing that they have blood on their hands for in both Syria and Yemen? And then could you tie it together to the association that essentially the United States has been arming Saudi Arabia in all of these conflicts?
Well, let's deal with Yemen because it's the story that doesn't get picked up at all.
Thank you.
Yemen has been effectively destroyed and forgotten. Half the population is in almost starvation conditions. The country is lost the ability to function as a country. The war is been brutal. The bombing has been consistent. Civilian infrastructure has been targeted. The British, the Americans, and others have resupplied Saudi Arabia during this period, which is why various human rights agencies have said that the West is complicit in the war crimes in Yemen. The story of Yemen by itself is an atrocity. It's an abomination. On the one side, you have the Saudis who've been bombing the forces of the Houthis and the former president Abdullah al-Saleh. On the other side, joining the Saudi coalition to fight against Saleh and to fight against the Houthis has been Al-Qaeda. So Al-Qaeda has been growing in force, and in a sense, the Saudi Air Force is Al-Qaeda Air Force, as far as these fighters are concerned. This is, has worried not only, Yemenis, people who watch Yemen, but it's also worried sections of the American establishment, who spent over a decade drone bombing Yemen to take out the leadership of Al-Qaeda, and of course haven't succeeded in those aims at all. But now they see Al-Qaeda making territorial gains inside Yemen underneath Saudi air cover. So this is a very, very serious and disturbing, series of events in this country being destroyed in front of our eyes. This is the fourth Arab country being destroyed in about 15 years. Iraq was wrecked, Libya was destroyed, Syria has been destroyed, and now Yemen has been destroyed. This is the fourth Arab country destroyed by interventionism in which the West is complicit. So this is a very serious issue, and I wish it got much more coverage. In Syria, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Turks, and others have played a very duplicitous game. It's all about deniability,
So where does that lead? You call a complicit relationship that the United States government has with Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Could you use stronger words? I mean, we're really...
it's actually, that's not my word, that's the word from human rights agencies, and I think it's fairly strong. That the United States, Britain, etc. are basically party to war crimes in Yemen. If indeed at any point there is a serious investigation if charges are framed in the criminal court, at least the British would have to face these charges. The United States very conveniently likes to send people to the criminal court, but itself is not a member.
Right.
It talks a lot about human rights, but it won't be, a co-equal member of the International Criminal Court. So, whether there's complicity in the United States or not, it's actually jurisdictionally irrelevant.
If I said that Barack Obama could be accused of war crimes because of what is going on in Yemen, is that a complete assertion for you?
I mean, that could very well be, but the problem is that there is no jurisdiction that any U.S. official has allowed themselves to fall under. So in the end, if I say Barack Obama is a war criminal, that's a moral claim. Because the United States, and I think U.S. citizens need to think about this seriously, because the United States has put itself in an exceptional category outside the jurisdiction of international law, because of that, any complaint about U.S. behavior in warfare is merely moral. It relies on American courts to take action, but we well know that here it's not a legal issue but a sociological issue. Which American court has ever indicted an American president for war crimes overseas? There's no history of that. So we are seriously stuck. We can have a moral complaint and go blue in the face yelling war criminal, but there is no jurisdiction. And here I really think it's to the American public to think about why we back political forces that oppose and obstruct a U.S. entry into the International Criminal Court system.
Well, I go blue in the face saying that Barack Obama has committed war crimes, and it's over drones. It's for a lot of reasons. The United Nations, what role could they be playing in this if the United Nations was not being complicit?
Well, this is important. The United Nations is merely a function of the geopolitics that are of the moment. So the UN is in two pieces. On the one side, there are the agencies that do very, very good and important work picking up the pieces of the suffering. Without the World Food Program, without the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, without these agencies, the pain of these wars would be immense. I can't even begin to express to you what it would have meant for the Iraqis, the Syrians, the Libyans, the Yemenis, if there was no UN agency to provide food, shelter, help, assistance, a shoulder to cry on, for the people who are essentially the detritus of these regime change wars. That's a very important part of the UN. People who bash the UN forget that if the UN disappeared, there'd be no shoulder to cry on for people who have to suffer, the other end of a cluster munition. But the side of the UN that I think is important to consider is, say, the Security Council, which is essentially captive to geopolitical power. And unless the geopolitics change, the Security Council cannot do anything. At this point, the Security Council is still controlled by the West, and not by majority vote or anything like that. It's just that the West seems to have a much more authority over the Secretariat, over the behavior of the Secretary General, etc. So until there is a shift in the geopolitics, until the Chinese, Russians, and others assert themselves, fight to make the UN a more multipolar institution, it cannot effectively deal with any of these crises politically. It appears paralyzed. It's paralyzed because the geopolitics are paralyzed. I think its complicity comes, most dramatically when it allows votes to go through which legitimize war. So, the vote, UN Security Council Resolution 1973 on Libya makes the UN complicit, fully complicit, in the destruction of Libya. There is no accountability for that. There is no investigation of that. NATO is complicit in the destruction of Libya. Now, the UN has played a marginal role vis-a-vis Yemen. They barely can function in Yemen in terms of politically function in Yemen. So, this is a function of geopolitics. Until that changes, until countries like Brazil, India, South Africa, etc., assert themselves with much more force, nothing is going to change.
Under the international criminal courts, would Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton be called in for Yemen?
The first people that would be called in Yemen, of course, would be the
I'm sorry,
Gulf family.
Libya.
For Libya,
Yes.
there is a rogue gallery that should be called in for Libya, which includes, of course, Nicolas Sarkozy, David Cameron, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama. All of them should be deposed to find out, why they began to have this rush to war under the false pretenses that civilians were being massacred in the thousands. When after the war, Human Rights Watch showed that in those first few weeks, the death toll was about 350, nowhere near the tens of thousands being talked about by the United States, by Britain, by France. They exaggerated something in order to get a certain outcome. So yes, I believe they should certainly be deposed.
I have two final questions, and if this one would open up too much discussion, but there's not enough information on this. There's a strong alignment that doesn't get talked about between Saudi Arabia and Israel. It's sort of a triangle between the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. How are you seeing that played out for what people should understand better?
Well, in a sense, the antipathy of Saudi Arabia to Iran has drawn Saudi Arabia and Israel into the same camp. This has been one of the outcomes of this fear-mongering, this paranoia in Saudi Arabia and Israel vis-a-vis Iran. The other thing, of course, that draws them together is they're both theocratic states. They are both ethnocratic, theocratic states. They are about religion. There are very few other states like that, that have such a deep commitment to one religion. And this is shared between these two countries. There's a temperamental similarity in terms of their understanding of the region. And both of them essentially are pillars of stability for the United States. So for several decades, they've been working extremely closely with each other. And I think this is something people need to pay attention to. But by the way, I'm glad that there is now a serious conversation about Saudi Arabia. There has been in the United States progressive and peace movement already a conversation about Israel, which is fairly mature and well developed. Mm-hmm. But this conversation about Saudi Arabia is long overdue. When there's a bombing by Israel of Gaza, there are demonstrations all across the United States. Saudi Arabia has been bombing Yemen since March 26th of last year, and there have been almost no demonstrations in this country, despite the fact that the United States is utterly complicit in that war. I'm very happy to have this conversation open up now about the parallel complicity of the United States with Israel and Saudi Arabia. It's not merely that Israel is the sort of proxy of the United States in the region, it's Israel and Saudi Arabia.
So I'm going to put links to some of your interviews that I think are so important for people to understand how Vijay reframes some of these issues, so that as we're hearing in this presidential year the debate or the lack of it on foreign policy in the Middle East, you can start to look at it through what he's saying here with regards to the dialogue of foreign policy in the Middle East.
I mean, there's a world to understand. It's one of the principal issues is that the American media has been pretty much, unable or unwilling, for whatever reason. It's up to them to explain the reason. But they've been generally unwilling to open up serious questions about the state of the world, the reason why the United States has military bases in most countries in the world, why they are so quick to justify Western interventionism, but when other people intervene, it's a bad thing. They'll say Iran shouldn't have influence in Syria, but it's perfectly okay for the United States to have influence everywhere. This is something that the world doesn't understand in the same way as Americans do. It's a perplexing thing that Americans are taught through our media to understand the world essentially as a playground for U.S. power. In the 19th century, there was a Platt Amendment which suggested to the Cuban people that if the US government at any point was unhappy with events in Cuba, the US could intervene. It was called the Platt Amendment. Well, we sort of live with the illusion that there's a global Platt Amendment. Anytime there's something anywhere in the world the United States government doesn't like, it feels it can intervene. I think this is an issue that people need to think about. Whether it's the role of the United States to intervene everywhere, if it's a responsibility, if it's an obligation, if this is indeed a good way for the United States to see itself in the neighborhood of the planet. And most people around the world don't accept this global Platt Amendment. And that is the cause of a great deal of friction and animosity against the United States. And I think here the media doesn't do its job to properly explain to the American people why there is this resentment and anger at the global Platt Amendment.
Vijay, thank you so much for all your dedication, and personally thank you for the way you've educated me through all of your work.
You're very kind. Thanks.